So today we will be covering the first essay of the phenomenon of life. The title is Life, Death, and the Body in the Theory of Being. And even though it's only the first essay, he really does get into into some very interesting conceptual spaces here, as we will see. Okay, so starting out, he lays the groundwork by talking about two different ways that man has interpreted himself and the universe. The first one being the original animistic interpretation, according to which everything is alive, everything is understood as alive. This is a view that he terms pan-vitalism. And in fact, this is something that I don't think he points out explicitly, but an important aspect of this is that it goes further than just saying that everything is understood by analogy with life. Because when we talk about analogy with life, we already have a particular view of life and matter, which of course here, before there was such a thing as dualism, didn't exist. That's essentially the first view. Bare, dead matter was something that hadn't yet been discovered. Everything was understood in accordance with life, and there the main problem, the main exception to that comprehensive view was the fact of death. So the body was normally intelligible as a living body, but as a corpse it became completely unintelligible. There was no way for man to make sense of it as a dead body, which is why there were different solutions to that problem, which he cites as myth, cult, and religious belief. In any case, different ways to assimilate death to life, in some way to negate it. And here Jonas also sketches out the framework of how such problems arise in general. So any problem in this sense is the conflict between a comprehensive view on the one hand and a particular fact on the other. So in the pan-vitalist picture, life is the comprehensive view. That is what explains everything, and death is the particular fact that can't be accounted for within that framework. Then when we move to modern thought, we have the opposite situation. So we have what Jonas terms pan-mechanism. Life is understood in terms of the lifeless. Dead matter is the primary, indeed the only intelligible ontological level. The body is thus intelligible only as a corpse. Then it makes sense. It's just a piece of matter that behaves the way pieces of matter typically behave. When the body is alive, that's when it isn't exactly intelligible. So if in the previous view, death had to be assimilated to life, here we have precisely the opposite. Life has to be assimilated to death in order to be understood. This is what he terms the ontological dominance of death. Here he also elaborates a bit on his claim that we're not just dealing with matter as some kind of a neutral ontological level. He says it is justified to talk about matter as dead matter because man arrived at that picture of matter through a sort of killing off of the life that man saw in the cosmos. It's what's left over after life has been subtracted, or rather killed off. And then he, of course, introduces dualism, so the framework that sort of mediates between those two positions. He starts off with what he calls the first expression of dualism, soma sema, the body as a tomb, the Orphic statement, which he sees as the first, it's a typo here, dualistic answer, or the discovery of the self. Now, this dualistic tendency, which started with Orphism, then matured with Christianity, and then, of course, Gnosticism, not surprisingly for Jonas. Its key feature is the mutual exclusion of body and soul. So having two ontological levels that can't be, that it's impossible to fit together, essentially. And most importantly here, everything that came after dualism is essentially post-dualistic in the sense that there's no going back to the to naive animism before there was dualism. Everything thereafter is marked by the presence of dualism. When it comes to different ways to understand reality after dualism, there are two that he talks about, two types of post-dualistic monism: modern materialism and modern idealism. Now, both of these are partial monisms. This is precisely because the bifurcation of reality, the dualistic two-ness of the world, is not something that's an arbitrary invention of thought, but is rather grounded in reality itself, as Jonas puts it. Now, the way that these two types of monism deal with this two-ness, with this bifurcation, is by distinguishing between primary and secondary reality. Of course, the difference is merely that materialism takes matter to be primary and mind to be secondary, and vice versa for idealism. Now, both of these reductions fail at some particular point. With materialism, the reduction fails with consciousness, and with idealism, it fails when it encounters the thing in itself. Now, on the backdrop of this impasse of materialism and idealism, one option would be to look at those two approaches as two different methodological approaches. So to see matter and mind as two separate fields of reality that don't necessarily need to conflict. This, of course, sounds very lovely, but it would work only if those fields were completely closed in themselves, if they were isolated from one another. This, however, is not the case, and that we can see that precisely in the example of the living body. So the body, according to Jonas, gives us a very concrete and extremely glaringly obvious example of a self-transcendence in either direction. It's impossible to treat it just as matter or just as disembodied consciousness. Hence, it's impossible to see these two approaches as independent methods. Here's a nice and very short quote. "This body is the memento of the still unsolved question of ontology. What is being? And must be the canon of coming attempts to solve it. These attempts must move beyond the partial abstractions, body and soul, extension and thought, and the like, toward the hidden ground of their unity, and thus strive for an integral monism on a plane above the solidified alternatives." This integral monism, situated on the plane above, is something that Jonas unfortunately doesn't quite explain sufficiently just yet, but it sets the scene for what is a core concern of the book. In any case, what he's saying here is that this problem of life and of the body is a cardinal theme for ontology. It's not something that's significant only for the life sciences, for example, but is rather key in ontology as such. Interestingly enough, he points out materialism as being the more serious of the two post-dualistic options, of the two possibilities of monism. The reason for this is that materialism at least allows itself to encounter the living body in some way. Idealism, on the other hand, just brushes it off, it just writes it off as an appearance to consciousness, whereas materialism at least tries to take it seriously as something that actually exists. Idealism is, in fact, an epiphenomenon of materialism, as he puts it. This is one part that really echoes Merleau-Ponty quite a bit. This sort of the way he talks about the alternative between idealism and materialism. To quote, "Only a world objectified to pure extensive outwardness, as materialism conceived it, leaves opposite itself a pure consciousness which has no share in it." And then he goes on to claim that the same holds vice versa. Only a pure consciousness is compatible with pure extension. Now, one more quote, probably the last one, a bit longer here, but really beautiful, at least it's in my opinion. If matter was left dead on one side, then surely consciousness, brought into relief against it on the other side and becoming heir to all animistic vitality, should be the repository, even the distillate of life. But life does not bear distillation. It is somewhere between the purified aspects in their concretion. The abstractions themselves do not live. In truth, we repeat, the pure consciousness is as little alive as the pure matter standing over against it, and by the same token as little mortal. It lives as departed spirits live and cannot understand the world anymore. To it, the world is dead as it is dead to the world. The dualistic antithesis leads not to a heightening of the features of life through their concentration on one side, but to a deadening of both sides through their separation from the living middle. Really beautiful quote here, something that also, again, really reminded me of Merleau-Ponty, some of his more Instagrammable bits in the Fibonacci of Perception, for example. But here, this deadening of these two sides, this distillation, has consequences, of course. And those consequences go beyond just the life sciences as such. In fact, due to this, even causality as such becomes unintelligible with this kind of a ontology. And we'll soon see why. And here we are also slowly getting to the to one of the juicier and perhaps well, relatively dense bits of this text. So, what is the deal with causality? According to Kant's account, or rather Kant's answer to Hume's skepticism, causality is a concept of the pure understanding. This is something that is presupposed, that is absolutely key for Kant's view of causality. And this, which seems, I mean, one could definitely walk away from reading Kant thinking that that is a relatively innocuous part of his argument. But this is precisely the point that Jonas criticizes. According to Jonas, causality isn't some kind of an a priori basis of experience, but is itself a basic experience. We have the notion of causality because we have an experience of bodily force. We have the experience of overcoming resistance with our body, of doing something in the world. And without that, we could never have any kind of a notion of causality. There would be no debate on causality. And that is why causality has to be essentially present already in experience itself. According to this view, the one that Jonas is arguing for, man is the measure of all things, but he's not the measure of all things as some kind of a universal disembodied law-giving reason, but rather as a psychophysical totality, as Jonas puts it, the maximum of concrete ontological completeness from which ontology proceeds by subtraction. This is a fascinating point here that we'll probably get to in the discussion. But in any case, force, which is, once again, the root of causality, is here understood not as a datum, as something that will be given to pure consciousness, but rather as an actum, as something that is accomplished by the subject. Here, getting into the bit that's covered in the first appendix. So, pretty much in line with what I just said about the problem of causality, both Hume and Kant presuppose that the only mode of givenness is perception, and that perception is mere receptivity. Things can only be given to us as impressions to a pure consciousness, essentially. And if we accept this view, if we accept this epistemology, then there's no way to get around the fact that causality has to be a mental addition. It can't be in experience, it can't be a basic experience, but rather it has to be something that consciousness somehow or other adds on post factum. Here, Jonas does something that's really really fascinating. I personally found it the trickiest bit of this first essay. I don't know if many of you would agree, but we'll see. This inversion of Hume's problem. Now, this is a thing that it's a relatively short paragraph, but one that definitely requires a couple of readings on a good day. So this inversion deals with the paradox that a specific causal nexus, namely affection of the senses, should terminate in its own presentational suppression as part of its specific performance. This is not the clearest sentence in the world, but basically, to boil it down, perception gives us things, the senses give us impressions, and this process of giving us impressions includes the suppression of the fact that it is a causal process. So we're not aware of a causal process that would lead to our impressions, but rather we are just aware of the impressions themselves. This is essentially a way to boil it down. That's the suppression of causality that he talks about. Here he also mentions just briefly Whitehead and Whitehead's distinction between causal efficacy and presentational immediacy. Now, I am not remotely competent to comment on that any more than that, but luckily we may or may not have someone that just recently translated Whitehead, so we might have some some interesting insights in the discussion later. But at any rate, Jonas takes this inversion of Hume's problem and breaks it down into three separate questions that he treats in the first appendix. First, how the senses eliminate the causal imprint. Second, how this elimination extends to the general object picture. This is his expression, but basically to objectivity as such, our picture of reality. And finally, why such objectifying modes of knowledge by necessity monopolize knowledge, become spread out and essentially encapsulate knowledge as a whole. So, starting with the first question. Now here there was one bit that's methodologically strange, I would say. And last time when we spoke about the difference between Jonas and Plessner in this particular sense, I think this is the best example of that ever, because this is, I mean, to those of a more phenomenological bent that will probably, you've probably had eyebrows raised quite a bit reading this, but here he says that our analysis of perception needs to be at once genetic and phenomenological, because if it were only phenomenological, we would just fall prey to believing, taking at face value, the immediate information of our senses. And when he talks about genetic analysis, he does not have in mind genetic phenomenology, not at all. He has in mind something much methodologically radically different. Here's an example of what he means by this. I was really struck to read this sentence. The smallness in dimension, time rate, and energy of the unit actions and reactions involved in affection of the senses, i.e. their minute scale relative to the organism, permits their mass integration into one continuous and homogeneous effect, namely impression, in which not only the single impulses are absorbed, but the character of impulse as such is largely cancelled and replaced by that of detached image. So this is, it's not quite clear where he is at which point in terms of methodology, and we'll get to this in the discussion. At any rate, the result of this smallness is the apparent priority of enduring entity over occasional activity. So the originative ontological order is inverted. We don't see occasional activity, we don't see the causal processes, but simply the enduring entity, the picture, object picture we have. This then is the root of the problem of causality. Now, moving on to the second and third ways of posing this question. When it comes to objectivity, this suppression of object-subject causality, which is what we just discussed. So the causality that's suppressed is essentially that of the object affecting the senses and then leading to impressions. So that's suppressed in favor of static images. That is extended to object-object causality. Why? Because by neglecting this causal nexus of causal interconnections between subject and object, understanding, and also by, of course, by seeing the static object picture as something that's primary and that's essentially how to put it, that's essentially ultimate. Understanding is deprived of what he calls the one non-perceptual source, the force experience of my body in action. And like we just seen a moment ago, this has to do with the problem of causality. So neglecting this force experience, the embeddedness in a way of my body in action. Hence, causality becomes unintelligible. Finally, the third way, the third question here, what this has to do with knowledge as such. And this is another very fascinating thing, also something that has resonates with Merleau-Ponty, I'd say. The suppression of causality is what is at the root of the separation between appearance and reality, and ultimately leads to our distinction between essence and existence. Here's a very short quote on this. The stillness of object, aloof from the turmoil of forces, recurs enhanced in the stableness and permanent availability of idea. It is in the last analysis at the bottom of theory as such. So this very fundamental characteristic of perception, this bracketing of causality, if you will, is what grounds even the highest pinnacles of theory. This kind of a vertical connection, vertical epistemological connection is really fascinating here. Because of this, even our notion of substance is not something that would be just a, I don't know, a Western arbitrary fancy of the mind, but is simply the conceptual framing of perceptual truth. And this, I think, and I hope we will come back to in the discussion. Now, just the final bit, the second appendix, less demanding, easier to understand, where he talks about anthropomorphism and teleology. Okay, essentially, science has a problem with teleology, that much is clear enough. And here Jonas clarifies that what science has a problem with is immanent rather than transcendent teleology. So teleology as a modus operandi of nature itself, that is what is suspect, not transcendent teleology as some kind of an external aim that nature is forced to serve. The external aim view isn't really problematic, and in fact it was also it was accepted, taken for granted by many of the champions of modern science, insofar as it doesn't intervene with the function of nature itself. The problem is immanent teleology, teleology within nature itself. And why is this a problem, or rather how this is expressed? Well, here he quotes Bacon. Not going to quote the section that he quotes, but essentially Bacon's main objection is that the realm of final causes is something that belongs to the realm of man and not that of nature. So whereas the ancients would probably see that and say, oh, okay, of course teleology belongs to man, and that's precisely why we need to use it to understand nature. There has to be some kind of a commensurability here. It's interesting to note that with modern science with that kind of a view, that kind of an ontology, to say that final causes belong to the realm of man is already in and of itself enough to make them suspect, enough to make us think, okay, there must be something wrong here then. We can't just apply it to nature. Then Jonas sketches out an interesting kind of a anti-teleological great chain of being, I suppose, going from the Ionian rejection of mythological personification to criticism of Aristotelian finalism, especially with modern science, and then finally, even problems with efficient causation itself, as we've just seen. Even efficient causation becomes problematic when we follow that anti-teleological line to its end. Now, the problem with the rejection, the complete rejection of teleology, is that it does make sense in the dualistic framework, of course. So Bacon and Descartes, whom he quotes a lot, they don't need to have an issue with the rejection of teleology, because final causes, while they are indeed expunged from nature, they still exist within the res cogitans, within the completely isolated realm of man, of the mind, basically. The mind is something belonging only to man, of consciousness. But with post-dualistic science, we are once again faced with the dilemma here, because we no longer have the recourse to a separate ontological level where we can lock up these pesky final causes, but rather we must make up our minds. We can either accept purposiveness, teleology in living beings, and then figure out how what that means for our ontology, what it means for our view of the world in general, or we can stick to the idea of dead matter and then try to force that onto living beings, try to assimilate the living beings to dead matter. And that is the dilemma that Jonas ends on here, and that will also be where this presentation will end. So I hope, I do assume there will be questions. I'm just need to stop sharing my screen. Okay, thank you.
Nicely done, Adnan. Thanks for a really good presentation. I think we've went through the whole thing basically again, more or less. So now we can move on to questions and discussions. I said that I'll try to keep myself more in the horizon, in the background. So opening up the floor for others.
When we get to Whitehead, that might be a bit more difficult for you, but
the thing is that that particular part was not in the book I translated. So I can deflect the question, or maybe deflect it to Timothy, because no?
I was also kind of confused by the reference. It was actually kind of fitting, but I wasn't really sure how to connect it with what I know from what I've read. I do remember with Whitehead, I think this is even in the Science in the Modern World, where he makes this remark. It's very, very similar to what Jonas is saying, that science kind of undermines its own rhetoric concerning causality, so that in the end, nothing, even efficient causes, are thrown out of the system. Out of the framework, in the sense that all we are left with are basically correlations between, like, correlations between variables, like formalized in mathematical like formula, and that's it. Like you cannot point to any kind of like efficient causes in the Aristotelian sense that make no any sense in this picture. And I also remember that he makes this remark that in this sense, modern science is not mechanistic enough. Like that's his actual critique of modern science, that we should reintroduce some sort of causality. But just now I was trying to remember then what his approach actually entailed, like what specifically would a reintroducing of some sort of causality entail? Like what would that add to the picture? I mean, with Jonas, it's a little bit clearer. At least I'm not even sure whether I understand what Jonas is trying to introduce here, like with the notions of effort and stuff, like what exactly that means for the scientific like understanding of the world. But with Whitehead, I remember even less. I mean, I understand even less what he wants to achieve with like a reintroduction of some sort of efficient causes. Anyway, yeah, that was just my train of thought here.
Well,
so,
in regards to effort, I kind of interpreted it as this idea that cognition, in his view, is an active kind of thing. It's not just a passive reception of sense data, but it's like an activism. It's something that you're enacting, something that you're doing. So there's an effort involved in it. It's something you are involved with.
Yeah, I mean, I see what you mean. I didn't really extend it to cognition as such, but just at the very least, he does seem to be saying that we can't have cognition without that, in a sense, because we can't have causality without that. Without causalities, presumably we wouldn't have much of a cognition.
Timothy, what was the issue for you in regards to like how does this not, so the fact that you don't see how this might relate to scientific image of the world?
Yeah, basically, I mean, it's not really like it's not a critique of Jonas, but just like I'm not even certain to what extent he's like he's buying into the, like, let's say, modern scientific worldview, and whether he is. I mean, if we suppose that he is to some extent, then what exactly would his new notion of efficient causality add to the picture? Like, how would you integrate this notion into the like scientific understanding of, like, let's say, natural laws and stuff? Like that would be my, like, at this point, I'm not sure where exactly he's aiming at with this, because I understand that this is a legitimate phenomenological point. Like, yeah, of course we experience effort, but how would you integrate this notion of effort, like, into the, like, let's say, physics of inanimate objects? Like, is this something relevant for like physics as such, or maybe just physics of, I mean, biology of living beings, or I'm not sure at this point. So that, yeah, that would be my extended question.
Sebastian, unless you have a reply here, I'd say the way I understood it, I think the consequences are in a way similar to those of Varela's thought, in the sense that it's not that this changes the content of physics, but again, Jonas is not as explicit here in fleshing out these consequences as maybe the inactivists are, at least the early inactivists. But I sort of think that if you really follow through on this, if you take this notion of activity in perception and in cognition seriously, then yeah, I think you have to end up with kind of a similar epistemological position as Varela. So I think, again, it's not that the contents of physics would change, but in a way, something more radical would change the way that we understand science as such.
It's, if I may, that's interesting, because I have read completely different kind of dimension in this context. It reminded me of a Heideggerian theme, understanding causality as kind of attempt that we have to control the world. So let's say there's a connection between causality and action, because causality is sort of handle that we are trying to figure out in the world to act and control, to act on the world and control it. That's how I read it. Maybe I got it completely wrong, but like I see the link between action and causality here. So because we are acting, we are kind of force in the world. We have a kind of we are kind of geared into the causal world, or the world in as much as a causal domain, because the causes is they are the handles that we are identifying in the world to control it. This is kind of more Heideggerian, I think, reading, but maybe I got it wrong. Just feel free to correct me, or I hope it makes sense like this, but what do you think?
The way I understood it basically is that you do have to have causality. If you want to develop theoretical models of causality that you can use then in specific, say, scientific theories and models and what have you, you have to have the experience of causalities in this fundamental sense. So in this way, it would be this particular experience of force and effort in this embodied sense would be your gateway into the world, into its flesh, literally, because it's the only way where you are already there and you don't end up in a strange position where you either posit it as something that is outside and doesn't have anything to do with you, or you put it inside and you somehow project it, and then it doesn't really have anything to do with the world. But I think that he's trying to, in a certain sense, develop some sort of a ground underneath scientific feet, where science would have to probably say something like, true, there's like a certain anchoring on or ground beneath all of this, and then we can develop models that we can narrow down, use like circumscribed areas that we're trying to describe. And we know what we're talking about because we know what causality is. Causality is this particular force. So it's not a problem for me to use it in other domains in a way that makes sense. And if I don't have it, if I don't have this, I think that this is what Jonas is trying to say, that both, for example, Kant and some sort of a realist, say, who posits that causality is outside, they just skip this. They just somehow presuppose that somehow you know what causality is. And then Hume makes a valid point where he says, but you don't see causality, you don't see forces. What are you talking about? So Kant says, well, yeah, because I'm introducing them. But it's like, what does it mean for a mind, intelligible mind, to introduce, for a pure conscious something, introduce or impose something, imprint something into the world? We know that there are problems with that. Of course, you can maybe say it is a solution, but I think that that's his point. He's trying to have to demonstrate where the concrete aspect of causality would derive from, and it would be neither from the world nor from us.
I would add that there's something else that was like confusing me. I mean, it's related to a previous question where like Jonas isn't just dissatisfied with Kant because on the grounds that in a sense that the Kant is not clear where the categories of reason come from, but even more fundamentally, he's concerned that the categories are not a good way of conceptualizing causality, in the sense that causality cannot be conceptualized just as a kind of network of necessary connection between phenomena. There needs to be something else introduced. Like in this sense, it's, yeah, what exactly is this something else? What is this force that's being introduced to supplant or like to enrich this notion of causality as kind of sufficient reason?
Well, yeah, please go.
I was wondering if, in general, with his idea that the at least how I read it, that is the notion of causality in general is derived from this more primordial feeling of effort, as he calls it, etc. If in phenomenology in general, are there precursors? Does anyone know of such a notion? Because when I read it, I thought this is exactly the same as Maine de Biran, the French philosopher, and he interprets it's sort of like a Cartesianism, and the cogito for him is basically he uses this same term F4, and he also says all these notions, causality, for example, it's just derived from this feeling of effort that we have against bodily resistance, etc. And I thought that this is exactly the same. It was just my reading, and I don't know if it's more general or it's whatever.
But this is really interesting, the fact that you mentioned this. So whether Jonas knew it and didn't forget to mention it.
Yeah, I'm no expert on the Biran, but from what I know from it, it was exactly the same as this. So yeah, I don't know if there are more connections with other philosophers that say the same. Yeah.
I know that Merleau-Ponty did a course on Maine de Biran and others in the late 40s. So maybe there would be some source as well, but it's kind of forgotten philosopher, I think, Maine de Biran, or he was definitely at that time.
Yeah, it's mainly in French philosophy that there's certain people. You mentioned Merleau-Ponty. I didn't know he did courses in.
Yeah, in 48, 47, 48, he had a course on Maine de Biran, or several authors, but Maine de Biran was one of them.
So if we go back to the question causality, and then we can maybe branch out a little bit as well, but it's an interesting one. I think that what he's trying to say, Timothy, is that basically, if you end up just with formalisms, it's really dubious what causality would mean in a certain sense. You know, because if you have like these, of course you can frame it mathematically, but this framing also doesn't need causality, if you think about it. So you can express causality mathematically, but the mathematical expressions that you use for expressing causality themselves do not include causality. So what is it that you're expressing? So this is that special oomph that you need. And it doesn't make sense for you if you're just a mathematical being. You know, if it's just like correlations of sort. It could be a different type of relation as well. You know, so you're using a certain schema which does not include the specific thing that you're talking about. So if you just take the schema, it doesn't have to be about causality, it can be something else. So sure, you can express it like this, and the Kantian notion problematically, at least that's what I think, fails to capture this. You are not, I mean, you can say it, that you have a category of causality, but only because you already understand it. If you want to put it in terms that are completely in line with reason, that would be of this nature, it's dubious where you can do it. I think that this is what he's aiming at. I'm not necessarily saying, you know, maybe a Kantian would have a good rebuttal to this. I don't know, but that's the way I understand it.
I think there's an interesting structural parallel here between Jonas's account of causality and Merleau-Ponty's notion of the relationship between the explicit and the tacit cogito, in a way. Because in both cases, the higher conceptual level, so causality as a general law, and also the cogito as explicit cogito, in a sense, rest upon something more fundamental. I think the structural parallel is interesting here, even though maybe somewhat incomplete, but that's also when we talked about other, when we mentioned the question of other authors, that distinction between explicit and tacit cogito was the first thing that came to mind for me. Because I think it's getting at something very similar. It's structurally an incredibly similar approach. And I don't know if anyone else sees it that way.
Jan?
Yeah, it makes sense. Makes sense. Well, I was a bit worried about this account of causality. It felt that, for me, at least to me, it felt that Jonas is trying to do exactly what Merleau-Ponty doesn't like, and that is building up perception out of the perceived. It seemed to me that actually he is, by explaining how, okay, the things are kind of causally affecting us, this is already all constructed out of the perceived, right? And this is like inverting the right order. At least I think Merleau-Ponty would put it like that. So you're not starting with the perception, but we are starting with the perceived. Therefore, we are in circle, and this is not the good logic. But this is how Merleau-Ponty, I think, would argue. And this is also connected to another point. I was a bit also, I think, Adnan, you mentioned that this Jonasian account reminds you what Merleau-Ponty does in the phenomenology of perception. However, in the phenomenology of perception, usually the materialism is the weaker, adversary. Whereas here with Jonas, the materialism seems to be the stronger, right? So for Merleau-Ponty, the transcendental position is stronger always. So the materialism is gonna get put away first as something too simple, right? So and these two things are connected. Like so, Jonas seems to be constructing perception out of the perceived, and therefore, or correspondingly, he is more friendly with the materialism. There were two ideas related to Merleau-Ponty that I wanted to mention, and yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great insight. Definitely, yeah. I don't think it's a coincidence that Jonas tends to privilege materialism and also to overstep certain methodological boundaries in a way. But when it comes to causality, I think we can sort of look at Jonas's account, and we can split it up into two different claims. One being that causality, as our notion of causality, is grounded in a bodily experience of force. I don't think Merleau-Ponty would have a problem with that. And the other, when he talks about things causing impressions and smallness of impressions, that's just, of course, that's just methodologically going all over the place a bit. And not necessarily, I don't want to dismiss it out of hand, of course, but it would make sense maybe to sort of be explicit about one's methodology at the start. But yeah, I think we can split it up into two types of claims in that way.
Maybe to join in here with this particular two things, which I found very interesting, the ones that you mentioned, Jan. So the first one, I think that quote that you mentioned, Adnan, is very telling, and the one that you referred to now, where basically he starts off by, now I'm going to present why in the perception you really don't have the causal chain anymore, so that by presenting a thing at the same time there is like this hiding of its causal structure or dynamics. And then basically he goes to an account which is precisely on the level of the perceived, like a semi-naturalistic account of sorts, and a strange one at that. Like it's a really strange one. Right? You have small effects, and because you're a complex organism, you somehow integrate them into a static picture. That's like, he could easily have said, and then a miracle happens here, and the causality is gone. So that's a strange one. That's definitely like a very strange one. That's one thing. And the other thing is, I found this comment that you made like really, really interesting. The fact that Merleau-Ponty does find idealism as the tough opponent, and materialism is almost like this peasant that is superseded, and we just have to mention him to get to the transcendentalist view. But Jonas basically turns the picture around. And I wonder, I'm not necessarily sure whether this is conducive to the philosophical discussion per se, but I wonder whether it has to do with basically the milieu they were working in. Namely, Merleau-Ponty, with the background of the really, really strong French idealist tradition and also spiritualist tradition. And then with these glimmerings happening with Bergson, where you have like this alternative point of view and the clash between Bergson and Braunschweig, so the idealist Braunschweig versus Bergson. And there was like a really, really solid, proper, rigorous idealist tradition that you don't want to mess with. And they already did the dirty work in the sense of just showing why naturalism and realism is philosophically naive. Jonas, on the other hand, is operating in the frigging USA. Yeah, so he's surrounded by these analytic philosophers. They want to naturalize epistemology and everything. So their idealism seems almost like this sterile, hermetic, dead thing for obscure German philosophers from the 19th and the early 20th century, maybe. And, I wonder whether this has to do with it, that Jonas basically saw, okay, I'm surrounded by this milieu where realism is the only alive force, so to speak, as a philosophy, whereas Merleau-Ponty, he had to fight the academic, heavyweights, Braunschweig and all the guys who kind of developed the proper idealist tradition. So that was serious stuff. But this is why it would be so interesting to put Jonas and Merleau-Ponty into a dialogue, because they have these similar approaches, but they differ greatly as well. I would really like to hear how Merleau-Ponty what he would say to when Jonas would say, well, clearly materialism is the one that is now alive. He would be like, what the heck are you talking about? Where is it alive? Because for Merleau-Ponty, it's dead also in science, the materialism and empiricism proper. For example, when he studies the quantum physics, what's his name? How do you pronounce it? De Broglie or Broglie, the quantum physicist. So he uses him constantly to show why basically in the physics itself it's kind of dead, and he uses Einstein as well against Einstein to show that this is the case. So that's interesting.
Some good points, I think. Very good points. Thanks for that.
I have another comment that's sort of related to this, like the difference between, thinking now concerning the difference between Merleau-Ponty and Jonas, so that their accounts of perception are totally different, or at least they seem so to me. Like with Merleau-Ponty, you couldn't really separate perception and bodily effort in this way. Like you couldn't make this demarcation. You always start from like some sort of integrated body schema, right? Where you have like sensory motor coordination. This involves bodily effort as much as it involves like taking in sense perception and integrating this in some sort of like way in which a bodily agent maneuvers his perceived environment, right? And with Jonas, it's exactly, he wants to make like this strict demarcation between like perception, which culminates in this some sort of static picture kind of consciousness, and on the other hand, you have like this bodily effort that seems to be sort of like decoupled from, like, I'm not really sure what the connection between sensations and bodily effort is with Jonas, because if you don't integrate it in some sort of way, then I think that also you cannot really make this step of like relating bodily effort to any sort of epistemology in the way that Merleau-Ponty does, or in the way that Varela does, right? Where you have this sort of, let's say, pragmatist epistemology that involves some sort of action on the part of the perceiving subject, right? Here with Jonas, it seems like there's no connection between the epistemological level and the level of bodily effort. Or am I misreading this?
No, I just think that he will develop this later on, that it will be precisely through movement that you get to the static pictures, if I'm not mistaken. you know, so he does kind of flesh this out literally.
It seemed to me that that was precisely what he was criticizing, this view of perception that both like Kant and maybe Hume assume, like Jonas is criticizing that perception is taken to be separated too, because the body isn't taken into account.
Yeah, but I think that Timmy doesn't see how he integrates it. I just think that he doesn't do it yet, but I think that this is the direction he's heading in. Yeah, any other topics? So that we don't get bogged down.
Just comment on the materialism thing. So why he tackles materialism, it's not just because he thinks, I don't know what phrase we use, it's the weaker enemy or the more serious enemy, I don't know, but he also makes this point, the reason he starts with materialism is because it's in touch with the living body in a sense, and the living body plays a big role in the way he wants to develop his theory. So I guess that's that point as well.
And in this sense, he's similar to Merleau-Ponty. This is precisely what he's making when he's making a case against the idealist. He's saying that this is what you're missing, the passivity, and it's something that is kind of, or density, inert, like, you know.
Well, it can be quite unclear what does materialism has to do with the body, you know, with the living body. It's not obvious at all. We can say the same thing. Okay, living body is a whole, it's a totality, so it has very much to do with idealism, or you know, we can say the same thing for idealism. I don't see the closeness or the link, or at least it's not evident for me. It's not self-evident, the link between body and materialism. And Merleau-Ponty wouldn't put it like this, in my sense. You know, there's nothing inherently material about the living body.
Yeah, I know. The thing that he points out is this element of passivity that is somehow then present, so that, you know, that not everything can be accounted for by action. You cannot exhaust it. There is an element of resistance of sorts. The passivity is, when he talks about the truth of naturalism in the structure of behavior, this is what the main issue is. So the passivity is overlooked and cannot be accounted for properly by idealism. It basically boils down to just this having what's it called in Kant? Raznouteria.
Multiplicity.
Manifold, yeah. Manifold, yeah. You know, the manifold of sensation, which is basically just saying X. So yeah.
But wouldn't idealism diminish the body more compared to materialism? Like, it just says the body is just an idea, whereas the materialism still insists on the body, which I'm feeling, which I'm perceiving, which I'm moving and acting within. It is a real thing, worthy of being considered on its own terms, rather than being reduced to just some kind of mental idea.
Can I just jump in with my reading of this Jonas's preference for materialism? Like, the way I read it and the way I would also kind of agree with it is that when you start with materialism in the sense of trying to explain external phenomena, if you want to account for like the way the let's say a human or an animal actually behaves as observed from the outside, you would have to introduce some sort of new notions. You would be forced to sort of revolutionize your approach in order to explain the actual behavior that you observe. Whereas with idealism, you're not ever confronted with this problem, right? You can always say, like, I mean, the body is just an idea that I have along other ideas, and you're always kind of, well, I'm not really sure how to explain this. Why the idealist approach is more easy? Maybe it's not. Maybe it's actually not. I would have to think about this. But
in my reading, I think Jonas' preference for materialism is it's just practical. It's like, if you go the idealist route, we can't say anything about the outside world, and we can't say anything about the genesis of experience from within nature or whatever. And that's pretty much it. It's like you see today with a while ago with like what's his name, like après la finitude, the speculative materialist stuff, you know, where the argument is basically you can't say anything if you choose the idealist or the transcendental perspective, and that's pretty much the argument, you know, which is fine. It's totally true. If you go the idealist route, you can't say anything about the material world. It's true, but it's still a problem.
Yeah, that's true, and I think that you know, this goes back to what I was saying before. For example, you in France, you had these heavy-duty idealists who literally developed like the whole account, Braunschweig, how you basically get to the development of reality and everything from within. So it was a really kind of a complex system, but an elaborate and a robust one. So, you know, I'm not saying that it should be taken seriously. Clearly, nobody knows about Braunschweig nowadays, let alone is interested in him, except for very few. But yeah, it's a valid point. At some point, this is what takes down the idealists until they get interesting again to people.
I think people have not given up on the idealism. I know there are several interpreters who really like to connect the Kant, Braunschweig, and Merleau-Ponty, and they are quite famous. Samantha Materne, one of them. They are really very active these days.
But we both agree that their reading is really strange.
Yeah, I don't like it, but you know, they are still well and alive, and they have their careers.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to add to something that Primož was commenting, like, okay, there is a sort of idealism a la Kant, but we have also Husserl, I think, and he's speaking about the lived body as an idea, as it is vulgarized. I think this is an idealistic, basically, idea in a sense, because you have all the body as it is perceived, as it is lived, is the 0 point of orientation. It's the sense of the field of sensations, etc. And when Jonas is speaking about the body as a kind of locus of the effort, we can take it really in this Husserlian way. You know, if it's not a material thing, how material thing could be connected to effort, I don't know. Nobody explained yet, but you know, I could read it in a Husserlian way as a sort of kind of subjective body, etc. So I can take it in an exactly idealistic way. What he's kind of, you know, noting about the body. So there would be a way how to. My point is, there would be a way how to interpret the body in an idealistic way. So that's why I was mentioning. Okay, for me, it's not self-evident that this is connected to materialism.
Well, the main point is that he finds both of them inadequate. I think that Thijs is probably correct on this one, in the sense of that he's being somewhat pragmatic in two terms. First one, the milieu he's operating in. The second one, maybe you end up with, and of course, I can already hear Jan rebuking what I'm about to say, but in a certain sense, with idealism, it seems that you can create yourself a very nice, sterile, safe space, you know, in the sense of, yeah, I know, of course, but I completely agree, because as a materialist, you do it as well. When you see these scientific people, they're like they're living in a very, very safe space. So, but I think that it's more, let's say, in a certain sense, open to the possibility of the eruption of the unexpected, at least as a possibility. And it's kind of, in principle, seems to be more open to that. And that, in that way, it is maybe more anchored in this density of the living body, which is precisely that. Okay. Any other topics you want to get into? So causality, materialism versus idealism, and now, yeah, the body and anthropomorphism. That's an interesting one as well. So I don't know. Go in any direction you want. Yes. So
Yeah, I would like to link it, like link these ideas with neurophenomenology, and I have some questions and reflections. Like Jonas talks about the illusory separation between the sciences of nature and the sciences of mind, and he says that is a result of the partial monisms of materialism and idealism. So I had thought that neurophenomenology could be a way to overcome the separation, but then after he kept on making his point, he said that Jonas says that he these kinds of may disregard the neurophenomenological solution, and I'm quoting this, like complementary descriptions of the same subject from different sides, which can skew the question of how those abstract aspects concretely come into being, no? Something like that. So this is, I think, relevant for enactive cognitive sciences. I don't know if he will disregard neurophenomenology because being abstract aspects, that if you go into one direction, like studying the body from neurosciences, like you eliminate the other one. And then if you go from the phenomenology, you will have to eliminate the material side. I don't know, it's just some random ideas, but I was also, don't know if Jonas is worried about methodology, and also a very, very relevant point for also in active cognitive sciences is that it seems that this methodological problem will remain without a proper solution in the absence of a new ontology. But I think it's something that you were pointing out last session, Seth. But I don't know, it's a question for everyone.
this is a good point. You were reading the first part from the page 17, right? Where he talks about this methodological distinction. So even if you say, you know, Adnan, when you were talking about if you disregard ontological and just go to the ontic and talk about doing it like two supplementary approaches. And interestingly enough, I would show you this, but you probably won't see it. I actually wrote, it doesn't show, but it says possible critique of NPH, which is possible critique of neurophenomenology. Yeah, because it would seem that from the Jonasian approach, he would argue that what neurophenomenology is trying to do is missing the point from the very beginning, because you're approaching things from two perspectives and thereby presupposing that they're different, so you really won't be able to combine them. Now, this is not a bad point. I think that neurophenomenologists should take it seriously. One thing that I saw in Varela's later writings, and I'm going to try to answer this or explain this in a way that will be the least name dropping possible. Yeah. So the idea behind neurophenomenology is to combine rigorous neuroscientific research with rigorous phenomenological analysis. So scientists, according to Varela, shouldn't dismiss phenomenology or pretend that it's not there. If you want to understand experience, consciousness, you have to have both. Now, of course, the question emerges, yeah, what the heck? How does this solve the so-called hard problem of consciousness? It seems like you're just doing two separate things, you know. So from what I was able to see is in his later texts, which are slightly all over the place. But I have the impression that the general idea is to kind of try to push both approaches to the limits where they kind of, because they're constantly in touch with their opposite, they reach their own limits and are kind of pulled or pushed across them. So for example, transcendental epistemology is put face to face with neuroscience, and neuroscience is put face to face phenomenology. And at a certain point, phenomenology can no longer seriously defend a certain radical transcendentalist position. And on the other hand, naive naturalism sees that it cannot really be self-subsistent in that way. So Varela's approach is a little bit like, let's put them together, and slowly they will see that they both gravitate towards, he says, like a common ontological sphere or domain, and he calls it Leibkörper. So this coined term by Husserl, which is basically one word and combines lived or living body and body or physical or objective body, so Leib and Körper. And he's intentionally using Leib-Körper because he's also then referring to Latour and the mixed objects or quasi-objects, like the objects that precede the split into two different categories, like amorphous or amphibian entities. So I think that so to put it simply, Varela would respond to Jonas that Jonas makes the mistake because he's presupposing that these categories are set in stone, but they are the result of concrete practice, both philosophical and scientific. And if you just engage with both traditions in a way where they constantly have to confront one another, they're likely to kind of gravitate towards something. I'm not sure whether this is a satisfying solution. I'm just trying to say how Varela tries to answer this, because in later texts he does say something similar. So you need like a common ontological domain where both are somehow anchored or grounded. So I don't know if
it makes sense. Yeah,
it was okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't know about the reference to Latour by Varela. So I don't know.
So in this, in two texts, I found that he was talking about this notion of mixed objects and quasi-objects. It's like very late text. I think it's 1999 and 2000. So 1 or 2 years before he passed. And not particularly well-known text. So yeah.
Let me just add, because I was recently rereading Neurophenomenology, the article, and I was struck by exactly this, because previously I understood the text more in lines of like, searching for some sort of total convergence, or let's say some sort of isomorphism between the two disciplines, like where you would arrive at some sort of like when the two let's say the insights of the two disciplines would totally overlap, then you would have like a neural phenological discipline. But it's precisely like Varela is explicit there that he doesn't. Isomorphism isn't the starting point. It may not necessarily even be the end point of these two disciplines. It's precisely like because the two disciplines have like two very different approaches towards the same subject matter, that you can you can arrive at some sort of they can help construct new concepts. Like they can be in dialogue in the sense that both are not set in stone. Both have their open issues. They're like problems that have to still have to be solved. Like it's not that we have like a satisfying theory of how the brain works. And on the other hand, it's probably, you could argue that phenomenology also has some issues with its basic concepts as well. So in this sense, it's more of a like mutual attempt of formulating solution to open problems, not to like, let's say, develop a fully like some sort of monistic theory, enclosed theory of the mind. And in that sense, it makes perfect sense to me. And it could be like considered to be like a valid reproach to Jonas.
I want to thank Susanna also for pointing out this connection, because I have a similar experience with inactivism more generally. I'm not happy with how they, comment on the problem of embodiment. I remember reading the Inactivist Intervention by Gallagher, so that's 2017, I think, and he's very happy just putting side by side the body as a material structure and the body as a phenomenological structure, as a lived body, and he doesn't bother, pushing them closer to each other. And there are many other people who are working exactly like that, and they just do exactly what Jonas is criticizing here, without finding this third domain, I think, or maybe sometime. But I have read many texts from inactivists, or so-called, or 4E cognition theorists, who are very happy with the parallelism. So it's good to be aware of it. Thanks to Jonas and Susanna.
Any further topics we want to breach?
Okay, maybe I have one. I feel like a lot of these thinkers that we're dealing with in general start with this idea that we need to expand the range of phenomena we take into account, so we don't limit them according to, say, mechanistic materialist conceptions or something like that. In Plessner, we have the notion of intuition, which includes all kinds of things and qualities, from color to being alive and so forth. And also, Jonas seems to be making, I think, a somewhat similar point when he says that, like, for example, with the notion of effort, with his introduction of the body into our examination. And he says that this traditional Cartesian, more cognitive approach to how we perceive the world and how we interpret and get to know about the world is too narrow, that we need to introduce, because it excludes the other kinds of relationships with the world that we can have. So, for example, maybe this more embodied, this more practical relationship with the world that we experience, for example, when we feel this effort, when we feel these forces that we are acting with and that act upon us. So maybe this is interesting an interesting topic for discussion is, what do we know? How important is it to expand the range of phenomena that we deal with in comparison to what traditional science, for example, deals with, and on the other hand, what philosophy tends to deal with? How important is this in trying to face with the problem of life and, of course, consciousness and humans within this? I'm not sure if this made sense, but maybe it's rung any bell.
I'm not sure what the opposite would be, like trying to think about less.
Yeah,
like,
but that's basically what science is doing, isn't it? Like,
you mean like yeah, like bracketing the domains in for example, with Descartes, you bracket like the separate domains of science or of thinking in general, like mind and then body. And your point is, if you do this, you can think about how they interact, for example, like this. So
yeah, that as well. I mean, if we look at empirical science, it basically focuses on a kind of a narrow range of phenomena and how we get to interpret these phenomena. We just, for example, with what we can sense and what we can quantify. But we have all these kinds of thinkers in Gestalt psychology and so forth, which tries to introduce further notions which are more than just the particular empirical data, but things that are on a kind of higher level. So, for example, qualities like colors. And I think we read him like a couple book clubs ago. In Plessner, he also includes that within this range of phenomena which we have to look at, like that give themselves give themselves to us in our intuition, is also something like the quality of being alive. And also Jonas again seems to be trying to say that we need to take into account other kinds of relationships that we can have with life, with phenomena, that include things like bodily effort and movement and so forth. And this is also, I think, a big notion in activism, that it tries to get away from this more passive, receptive conception of cognition, and tries to expand what we are actually ready to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, some things that might come to mind, I don't know. One thing that gets often forgotten is that science is a specific philosophical project that turned out to be quite successful for quite some time. Ultimately, it is a very specific set of assumptions of how you're going to approach the world and what constitutes legitimate forms of knowing, and also correlatively beings that truly can be said to exist, that somehow correspond to these forms of knowing. And it has turned out to be successful, but also I think that in the last century or two, it has become more and more obvious that there are certain neurologic points that you can dance around, prance around. And at the beginning, there was an idea, if we just kind of give it some time, we will eventually find a solution. And it's still quite popular nowadays. You have this, what's the chubby black guy who's really into science, Neil deGrasse, or yeah, I mean,
deGrasse Tyson.
What's that all about, in the sense of, if you really need to know that there's like a very specific background philosophy about behind, it's seeing people like that who just really still believe in this program hardcore and really are into it. But the thing is, like I said, that issues have started to develop from two different fronts. One is the philosophical front, the second one, the scientific front. So science implicitly, and I think that most people find this more convincing than just philosophical critiques, has often found itself in a position where it seems that the domains and categories it was operating with are not really necessarily fully adequate and exhaustive of what it's even trying to do. And of course, you had like ample criticism from without. So I think that it's just something that is, it's a part of the movement that is happening both from the outside and the inside, where it seems that these specific phenomena that you refer to, or the domains of phenomena, just fail to achieve or deliver. They achieve and deliver ideologically, because ultimately you can always find one way or another to then just post hoc say, oh, but yeah, this is like really strange, but we can still somehow account this for, I don't know, with fundamental understanding of causality and whatnot. And I think that at this point it's just a really big mess in many ways. And these authors that you're referring to, they're trying to experiment with ways how you would, what would it mean to introduce other categories and notions and allow for these other domains, and what the implications would be. So because it is in a sense a period of prolonged and profound crisis in many ways, where just things are kind of whirling around, and nobody really knows how to handle this, but the impression is that something is off. So that was just some of the things that I, the association that I had when you were saying. I'm not sure whether I really touched upon the things that you try to point out. But okay, so okay, let's make this slightly more concrete, just so that I don't leave it like hanging like this. For example, Plessner, right? Plessner, we're referring to him often. So he was really trying to find out, okay, if we take on board some of the critiques of certain approaches that developed in the Cartesian tradition, and we see their inadequacies, and we try to start from a different position, so that we start from, let's say, this domain of lived experience, and we try to build everything up from there. What would it mean? How do I establish like a rigorous method and approach, and what it would entail? So what does it mean if I expand the notion of what is intuitively given? That I say that not only are sensuous qualities given, and these are the only ones that count, but that I also make room for other categories, such as essences, and then you have different categories of essences. So what does it mean, and where does this lead me? And can I say something? Can I say anything intelligent about life? And if I can say anything intelligent about life, can it even provide a certain additional something to, say, a materialist conception of life or empiricist conception of life? So that's like a concrete example.
Did anyone have like a follow-up on this? Because I have something, but it's related, but no. Like one thing I've been thinking about is with Descartes. Like I was reading a letter from him to, it's at the end of his life, to Princess Elizabeth, and he says like, you have three primitive notions, the soul, body, and then there's the unity of both. And his entire point is basically saying before they are before body and mind are like different ontological categories, we posit them as different ontological things because in both cases we entertain different ways of thinking, different methods basically. And he says with like, if you want to know something about the soul or God even, you have to think metaphysically, he says, pure thinking. And if you want to know something about the body, you maybe do mathematics or anatomy or whatever. And then with the unity of both, he says that stop philosophy, just go for a walk or whatever. Look at the sun, something like this. And the entire Cartesian, at least Descartes' view, seems to me something like, on the one hand, there's an incredible stupidity to like using the Horn methods in the Horn area. So for example, it seems like we are in science, for example, the materialist standpoint in terms of the body, it would be limited if you start pointing out all these phenomenological problems, So you have to sort of let it go its way. And the same thing with phenomenology, like the standpoint of the unity of both. And this is, it seems when we talk about like the problems with Cartesianism, it's something with science, for example. It's something Descartes would also see as a type of idiocy, reductionism, for example, because he would say you're applying this materialist standpoint to everything, and it just doesn't work, That's sort of the virtue of dualism in a sense.
But isn't this actually what Jonas here criticizes, of just saying, okay, you have on this side, you have one area and materialism, and other side is the soul and idealism, and each have its own sciences, but that doesn't really work with phenomena like life, because life, and life especially as it's embodied, isn't able to be studied and understood as like from these completely polar opposites. You need to meet in the middle, and that's I think exactly the problem with Cartesianism, because it leads to this bifurcation into different directions, and that doesn't capture phenomena like life.
Yeah, I think Descartes, if you would Like I can imagine like someone like Heidegger explaining his philosophy to Descartes, and Descartes would say like, "Oh, that's very cool, but you're not doing science or philosophy. Go for a walk. You know, if you want to know about phenomena and how the body is lived, etc., go for a walk and maybe describe it in poetry or something." That's what he would say. I'm not saying it's correct, but that would be like the Cartesian point of view in a sense.
There's one issue that emerges here, or at least I see it. So Descartes, like you said, you know, he can say you can take different stances. Yeah, you can live, you can go for a walk, you can maybe just do whatever. So you're being in this realm of interpenetration of the spiritual and the body, and then you can position yourself in a way where you do one thing or another, like you described. But what he doesn't account for, but it's there and plays a really, really heavy role, is which domain are you into when you're doing the switching? So where do you start from? What is it that makes these switches? So, you know?
With Descartes, it's complex because, of course, he doesn't give an answer. There's two possible answers. One is the domain of the unity of soul and body, which is basically it's raw experience. It's how you pre-reflectively experience life. It's also how he says that a child experiences life before it learns mathematics or whatever, and starts to think about body in a scientific way, or before it learns metaphysics and whatever. So that would be one answer. And then you could, I'm not saying this is in Descartes, but you could give it even like a Heideggerian analysis, where, for example, you have this intuitive normal experience of life, and all of a sudden you get some type of disease on your leg or whatever, an ulcer or something, and then you have to figure out what's going on, and then you start doing more bodily science, you know, to figure it out. You could give this type of analysis, where like problems occur, and then you have to think about it. But then, of course, there's an order in the domains. If you want to be engaged with absolute certainty, this domain of metaphysics. And so there's two actually opposed answers you could give, I think.
Yeah.
In terms of phenomenology, it starts with the unity. It starts with lived experience, obviously. But in terms of absolute certainty, it's something else.
So I think that one of the issues here was that, for example, in what you might call the Cartesian heritage, this particular domain was just swept aside, because in a certain sense, from a rigorously epistemic point of view, it doesn't really play a role. But on the other hand, what you just said right now, it plays a certain grounding role. So I think that was one of the things that, for instance, the late 19th and early 20th century had issues with. And I'm not even necessarily saying that this is, let's say, Descartes' thing himself. Because, for example, when you read his text, you see how he was constantly struggling with the ideas that he was proposing. So, for instance, you read Descartes in in Meditations, and later in the Passions of the Soul, and you see that basically he tackles similar phenomena from different points of view, from different aspects and perspectives. So even the question of mind-body. So, you know, you will have some texts where he will be very categorical with regards, and then you have this particular letter, which is very famous precisely because he talks about this unity. But the problem that I think remains there is that he never managed to fully spell out what is the status of this unity with regards to the other two modes, which seem to be the epistemic ones. So the first one seems to be almost like a springboard. Yeah, you kind of jump from there, but it doesn't really have a certain gnostic moment. Yeah, if you really want to end up in the domain of knowledge, you have to end up in those categories. But the question is, can you truly make this jump, and what does it mean? And I still have the issues of, you know, where are you talking from when you are comparing these three modes of being? So what is this meta domain that you're talking about? Yeah, it's, you might say it's spirit, but then
pretty much. I guess that would be what Descartes would say. Yeah.
But then you already have a problem, because the spiritual domain, in a certain sense, has a certain so.
Yeah, it's totally problematic. I think I brought it up in the first place just to like, but at least I think for Descartes, there are virtues to dualism that we can't forget. And one of them being that, for example, I can imagine like a physicist, he just wants to do his thing, and physics goes forth and it discovers new things, whatever, or mathematics even. And the physicist or the mathematician, he doesn't want to be bothered with like a hardcore phenomenologist coming to him with all these questions, how he's like denying the life world or whatever, you know. And in the same way, you could put it in reverse. And so what I think, at least, is with Descartes, there's sort of this idea, whatever mode of thinking you choose, you can go all the way, because you don't have to be concerned with how it fits in with other areas of life. And it becomes totally weird, because you can't integrate the domains. And yeah, but there's at least a virtue. And how he sort of prevents it from getting weird is like in the letter I mentioned, for example, he says you should only do pure metaphysics a few hours a year, basically. and mathematics, or like what he calls thinking with the imagination about shapes and extension and movement, whatever, a few hours a day, and all the rest should be spent on like relaxation, so you stay grounded in the unity of mind and body, you know. So that's how he would solve it. But I think I just brought up because I think it's an interesting thing to entertain, and also because you were mentioning the Neil deGrasse Tyson person.
Yeah.
And I don't know him, but I think he's like a Richard Dawkins type, extreme, like science is going to save the world kind of person, right? Yeah. Maybe, I don't know how he spends his free time, but he could be an example of like what Descartes would call like an idiot. He's gone mad, like he's spending all his time on science, on this materialist point of view, and he's forgetting about all the rest, you know.
Yeah. Just for the record, idiot here has a very it's a terminological
technical term in
it's
Descartes.
a technical term in Descartes. Yeah, so it's actually a technical term. Jan, you have to intervene here. This is too Merleau-Ponty phenomenology led, and you have to.
Oh, no, I don't have to, but and I don't need to. But I agree with what was said. I think Jonas would agree. No, there is a certain virtue in dualism. That's why he's talking about post. We are all post-dualists. We cannot go before or below. And but I would probably disagree with the claim that we can be happy in just one of the domains. I think eventually the domain will bring us to the limit where we will be meeting the other. I think that's what Sebastian was describing with neurophenomenology. That's exactly it. One domain is limited, but by what was exposed to the other domain, and it will bring problems inherent to each of the domains. That's my opinion. But you know, I'm not a mathematician or whatever, so I don't know.
Yeah.
I wouldn't.
Sorry.
No.
I think I'm not sure if I even disagree, but let's suppose I disagree. Huh? Wouldn't like just this be contradicted by the reality of science, for example? Because it's precisely because it has taken on this extremely abstract nature, abstracting from all like lived qualities or whatever, that it's been able to have all the advances. And similarly, you can, for example, imagine a poet describing his experience and being bothered by a scientist who's like, it's not accurate, whatever, you know. In this case, it would also like block the progress of the poetry. Yeah? If you can speak of progress in terms of poetry, but you get the point.
No, I actually agree with this, and I think that for a while my view on this was kind of hovering, and then me and Timothy, we had quite a lot of debates on this question, and also with Isaac, who unfortunately is not here, but will be joining us. I think that the phenomenologist and philosopher has to make room and take seriously precisely this, that by establishing the domain of abstract and the formal, something truly important happens. So if you're just saying that, you know, this is somehow anchored in the Lebenswelt in the secondary fashion, that's a cheap shot. Because, for example, Whitehead for me in this regard was very, very important. It's precisely this domain of generality and formality that opens up qualitatively new ways of handling things and discovering relationships that you normally wouldn't, and you can't. And I think that, Jan, I see that you're thinking, I think that Merleau-Ponty had a good point on this. But one thing that where I would agree with Jan, even if this is true, I think that sooner or later, if you're doing science, unless you're doing something like very, very specific and narrow and focused, but as soon as you're trying to go to the more broader and fundamental questions of the domain you're working in, you're going to get into clashes, and you're going to have to do something about it. And here's the thing, here's how usually science does stuff. Usually it will say, for example, behaviors. They will say, we're not claiming that mental phenomena are just behavior. This is just a methodological posit. We just want to do our thing. We just want to measure. We just want to calculate. Yeah, I want to measure the physiological reactions. I'm not claiming that this is emotion. Then 10 and 20 years later, people are just asking, yeah, but what are emotions? What are emotions? And then 20 years later, they're like, well, there are these physiological reactions there. Yeah, so this is the problem. This is the problem that happens. And I don't think that necessarily Descartes himself would fall prey to this. Maybe he would, I don't know. But the thing is that very easily it can happen, because you can, I mean, these delineations, they are delineations, and in a certain sense, to a certain degree, they have to be at least somewhat pragmatic, and they are malleable, they can change. So once you work within a certain something, these domains will change and shift, and you are going to get into the limits, and also be forced to confront phenomena that you don't really know what to do with. And then, you know, the question is open. I think that Descartes already presupposed too nice a delineation, because he probably was envisioning two very narrow-minded specialists doing on really very specific things. But then, you know, he kind of presupposed you have like these neatly delineated territories, and that's basically it. But what if the limits themselves can shuffle? And what about those that work precisely at the borders? Yeah, and you don't really see it drawn. So you're kind of, you do a step and the other person says, hey, this is my ground. And you're like, no, it isn't, it's mine. So what then? You go for a walk, eh?
Yeah, that might be the moment to go for a walk. I would say, well, if I have to defend Descartes, this is apparently my position now, but defending Descartes, you would say, like, yeah, of course, the domains cross over at times. I don't really get the problem, you know. If you start from what seems to be most of the time, at least, Descartes' perspective, which is purely an epistemological perspective, sort of, where the viewpoint that leads to cogito, for example, it's a different way of looking than, for example, mathematical or the lived whatever. And it would be normal that things cross over. I don't know, because in the end we are a lived unity of mind and body, to the point where it's not even where when he's speaking about the lived domain, he's not talking about mind and matter touching like he would in other places. It's actually, there is no difference. It's one and the same. But no, it's of course it's a problem. But you give the example from behaviorism, but I don't really see how it's like, are there different examples of this? Because it seems like the behaviorist in your example, he's just crossing boundaries. So it's not like there's an actual I don't really comprehend what you mean by a limit point where, like, for example, you're doing science, and at a certain point you're forced to
Two more
add in.
examples. Two more examples. One example is like the one that I'm always trying to avoid, but I'm going to say it because it's a very handy one. Quantum mechanics and the observer problem of the question. Yeah. Okay. So that's like almost a cheap shot, and I hate it because it can go easily into like these esoteric things. So, but okay, this one. And then maybe another one that is more interesting is the case of cybernetics. So basically, cyberneticians, they really wanted to do hardcore science that would be proper science, and just really, really account for all the systems and for all the seemingly directed and organized systems in a way that would be amenable to natural scientific accounts. So in a certain sense, they wanted to erect the science of systems and like do it really, really hardcore, proper science. Yeah. And what happened eventually is that within the cybernetics movement itself, the cyberneticians realized that, well, wait, I, as an observer, I'm also a system. So how can I just talk about observed systems without not accounting for me as an observing system? So then you get the second order cybernetics, which is precisely that. It is a science that tries to introduce the observer into the epistemological edifice of science. So you see, it's like, again, the boundary, I'm not just, the third example would be complex dynamic systems, which is also a very, very murky area where you don't really know what's a model and what's what is that which is being modeled and how they relate. So I don't know, Timothy, you are sometimes handy with these examples. Maybe you can throw in some more.
I mean, I don't have any on the top of my head, but I mean, cybernetic is a great example, not only because it introduces the notion of the observer, but also just on the level of phenomena that it tries to explain on the, let's say, first order level, like just phenomena that you observe and try to explain. So cybernetics started as a kind of movement that tried to introduce some novel categories. I mean, this is also relevant for the discussions about Jonas. He even has a chapter on cybernetics in the sense that it encroaches on certain biological and psychological territories. Namely, let's take an example of purposiveness, purpose. Let's say, okay, so or teleology, and this is actually a question I've had on my mind because Jonas mentions teleology in this chapter, right? And there's this big issue with how to integrate it into the scientific edifice, and cybernetics try to do exactly that, and quite convincingly to my mind, at least. And I don't know exactly where I was going with this. I mean, now this is going to go in a direction like it has nothing to do with Sebastian's prompt. But anyway, yeah, I mean, to at least partially answer, yeah, like I don't even, yeah, it doesn't have to, the crossing of boundaries can be made in science from at least two different vantage points. In one sense, you could always try to introduce the observer, but also when you're observing living beings, you have to introduce concepts such as teleology, or at the very least, you have to explain why they are not relevant. I mean, this is sort of Jonas's point at the end of the chapter, right? Because we are at the crossroads of this dilemma, right? But either we have to go down the line of some sort of non-reductionism, introducing new concepts, or we have to go down the line of eliminative materialism, let's say, when we really have to show why the concept of teleology, say that actually doesn't apply even to the human realm. And this is well, this would be like an answer to the, but well, does anybody have further comments on this? Because maybe I would like to shuffle to the notion of teleology if nobody has. I mean, but we can conclude this. So yeah, if anybody has any comments on the previous conversation, maybe that would be better. to do now.
Okay, just one final angle on this particular question, Thais, because it's a good one. The thing is, the question, I mean, not necessarily the angle. The thing is that one way of looking at it would be to say what Descartes did in that particular letter might be methodologically and in many different ways very, very interesting. But if you don't really have a good account of the unity, what will happen is sooner or later you will have these transgressions on one side or the other, and this in-between ground will just be forgotten, and the other two branches will start fighting for the primacy. So unless you have also a really, really solid account of this unison, aside from simply saying, well, you go for a walk and when you're a kid, you get it. Yeah. What will happen is you will end up precisely having people forgetting that there is such a unity and just ending up being one or the other, or just dualist in the sense of where this remains like a bit of a mystery. So I think that this is something that could be.
I think I'd agree, and maybe Descartes would agree too, because I think you should take it seriously, the take a walk stuff, in the sense that he does realize that if that thought and the sense of pure material oriented thought, or the thinking as in, for example, the meditations, he does see it as like a dangerous thing. And it's a serious thing for him that you have to stop doing it. But he has there's no answer for the problem from within the actual philosophy. But in this sense, the more practical advice from him does play an actual function.
Yeah, this is maybe how you can also have a stretch or expansion into an approach that would be more, say, contemplatively grounded, where you actually also develop like techniques of reflection that are explicitly corporeal. So they can involve movement, or not necessarily, but they can involve the body as a whole. So for example, in certain forms of contemplation or what have you. So this would be a certain grounded where you have, and it's methodological. You don't just say, well, go and do something, but go and do something rigorously. You can also tackle this one rigorously, not just necessarily the one extreme and the other one. Yeah, just like you can train rigorously and you can do it properly, and you can maybe combine like this type of anchorage as well. Well, that's just more of a side note in a certain sense.
Just one slight note, if I may. I think it's also important to, I mean, in my view, and I guess in Plessner's view, whatever, this isn't just this view of being able to look at things from a more materialist point, from a more idealist point of view, and all the different sciences that belong to each sphere. It's not just a scientific, like a methodological problem, something that you fall into because you want to understand the world, like in a scientific way, but it's an existential position that you're thrown into as a human because of the way you are. This is ultimately switching between these two aspects, and then at the same time trying to look at things in a more unified manner. It's something which you're kind of fated to be dealing with, not just something you intellectually find your way into and lose your way into. But yeah, I guess when you said about various contemplative practices, that can be an answer, a way of trying to deal with this existential predicament of being like an eccentric human being who has to deal with these opposites that keep cropping up in our life.
Okay, Timmy, you want to go to the teleology stuff?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very general question, and I kind of confused. I mean, I'm always kind of uncertain what people mean when they say teleology or purposiveness, where it's not like explicitly defined. And here I had some issues. I mean, it's a notion that we all kind of intuitively understand, but then I started thinking about it and what exactly about teleology doesn't fit with science, with modern science. And I was just kind of, if anybody has any, like, briefly explain this notion, or maybe like how Jonas uses it, or maybe just to like maybe qualify it a bit. I mean, there's like maybe two kinds of slightly different conceptions of teleology that I was thinking about. The first one being more the kind of, let's say, ancient Aristotelian, where you have like natural essences, or like some sort of preferred state. Like you have just the notion of teleology is basically just sort of accounting for why certain beings have multiple options of behavior and always strive towards some sort of preferred state, or they have a preferred place in the world. Let's say fire goes up, water goes down, and stuff like that. So some sort of preferred state out of many options of how the thing may behave if it were forced to do something that it doesn't prefer. But then let's say the more modern notion of teleology always is a more kind of maybe more anthropomorphic one, where you have also this kind of planning involved, or let's say an idea of a future state, or some sort of idea of what you want to achieve. And there's this sort of mentality going on, and also some sort of cognition, right? And maybe these two notions, I didn't really know which one Leisner was addressing, and also whether they may be tied together, or so that would be my question, whether anyone could explain this, and maybe also why. I mean, this was something that was especially like inspired by cybernetics and other like 20th century scientific movement that tried to integrate the notion of teleology into a scientific edifice. I personally wouldn't have any I don't share Jonas's predicament here. I don't see why this would be such an issue, like trying to integrate teleology into the natural scientific framework. So that would be my question.
Anyone want to go at it? Okay, so I think that Jonas in general would be completely in agreement with you, and I think that the only point that he was trying to make is that if you go to a random natural scientist nowadays and you start, especially biologist, and you start talking to him or her, and you mention teleology, and they will have a knee-jerk reaction, and they will be like, that's, passé, that's ha ha ha, that's precisely what biology as science has shown that. And then you ask him or her, well, okay, so what is the deal with teleology? What bothers you? And usually, like he says in the text, they don't really know. They don't really even understand what the point is. And I think that the main issue that he was trying to develop here is to show that basically, from the scientific perspective, if you take it seriously, all the things fall apart, even the efficient causes. Even the efficient causes eventually don't really have place in it. So it's just very much philosophically internally inconsistent in that regard. And his point is that there is place for teleology. I also don't know how he understands teleology, but I would say that something along the lines of living beings as forms constituting the states that are somehow conducive to their well-being. Like the Goldsteinian notion of self-actualization, where you have like this well-being that you're driven towards, and it is somehow related to your own organization, and it determines certain criteria for how you're going to shuffle through the obstacles and how you're going to maneuver through the external influences. I don't know, you know, Varela would say this involves cognition. Okay, that's in the past, you know, I was maybe more sympathetic to this than I am now. Sometimes it seems like a bit of sleight of hand terminologically, but it doesn't really matter. I don't know. Does this? It's basically, it doesn't answer your question if I understood correctly.
No, I mean, yeah, I understand that also. Like, this is just a sort of setting up of the problem that where Jonas, of course, his whole like project involves like trying to a kind of a naturalization of teleology, let's say, right? So he would probably agree with me that there is some sort of place in the natural world for teleology, but from what I've read, like from what I've skipped forward, he does have a critique of cybernetics, to which we can, yeah, I mean, I'm presenting the chapter, so we can probably return to this issue where Jonas explicitly addresses it. So we can leave it at that.
Yeah, maybe so. And we've had a pretty lengthy session and an intense one, so I think this is a good place to wrap up, if you agree, unless you have some like really pressing questions. Like, you know, life and death Jonasian questions. Anyway, thanks for coming, everyone, and next round is Adnan in 2 weeks, right?
Yeah, 2 weeks from now. I'd also just take the opportunity to remind everyone that you are more than welcome to sign up to present one of the essays. The link to our schedule is in the email, in all of the emails. So yeah, feel free to write your name under one of the chapters.
Or just notify also Adnan, and it will be extremely, extremely useful, and we'll be very grateful, because it's you know, the type of thing that everybody tries to kind of dodge, but it's nice to have these intros. So yeah, you're warmly welcome to give it a go. So see you in 2 weeks. Yeah, be well. Ciao. Bye bye.